Hi, my name is Adam Conway. I'm the founder of Donkey Car, also one of the core community members, and maintain a lot of the hardware associated with Donkey Car. If you've seen any other videos talking about different car chassis or other things, I put those together with the idea that it would be a lot easier to show via video how to get those things done. But people keep on saying, can't you just do an end-to-end assembly video? And that's what this is. But first, it's worth mentioning kind of a few things about the hardware, kind of the philosophy behind the hardware, and then what we're going to cover in this video. So the philosophy of Donkey Car is that it's a truly open source and always open source platform. So we try and choose parts that are available worldwide. Like that's why we use metric components and not imperial components. We're making everything that's hard to get, make it 3D printable, make all those things open source. So really the idea behind this project is to make it so you can make everything yourself. That said, some parts can be expensive to buy on your own, and some parts can be hard to produce, like you may not have a 3D printer. So we offer, through the Donkey Car store, a kit, and that kit basically makes all those parts available to you. Proceeds from the store go back into the project, help invest in new R&D and other things. It's also worth mentioning what we're going to cover today. So I'm going to cover basically 4 different ways of creating a Donkey Car. One is with the Nano. This is the new NVIDIA Jetson Nano. It's great and it's much higher performance than the Raspberry Pi. However, the Raspberry Pi is perfectly fast enough. You can get going a long ways with the Raspberry Pi and don't need a Nano. It's really if you want to do more bleeding edge stuff. There's also some trade-offs to the Nano too, which I'll cover as we go through that. The Raspberry Pi, tried and true, certainly fast enough to do kind of all Donkey Car related things. Also, the great thing about the Raspberry Pi is it has a great roadmap. We know that there's going to be a Raspberry Pi 4. We know that there's going to be a Raspberry Pi 5. It'll get better and better and better over time. And the community support is really great. There's also we'll also cover the Sombrero, which is a custom board that we designed and built with the community. It's fully open source. It's available in the AutoRope AutoRope organization in GitHub, and then also just using the standard servo driver. So with that, let's dive in and start assembling the car. All right, so let's get started. First, I'll just go over the Nano. Normally, you'd assemble the Raspberry Pi like so, but we'll just go through how the Nano assembles. The standard hole pattern on the Donkey Car is for a Raspberry Pi, and the Nano is slightly different. We've created an adapter. Actually, this came from the community. A few members of the community produced adapters. I really liked them, but I wanted to make a few edits, so I created a version of the adapter, which is now available. There's a little arrow that goes towards the front of the Donkey Car. And you're like going, okay, which side is actually the front? Well, the way you know it's the front is because there's actually 2 holes on the side over here, and that's because it assembles like this. So you point that arrow towards the front. You put in 4 screws. You put in the Nano. The camera adapter goes towards the front, and you screw it down, and it should be centered if you've done it properly. And then it takes another 4 screws. I'd recommend putting all those screws in. The Nano is rather heavy. With the Raspberry Pi, you can actually get away with just putting in 2 diagonal screws if you lose a screw or something like that. So one other thing to know about the Nano is that the Nano requires a special camera. It requires a Raspberry Pi 2 camera, which does not have a wide angle option. So you have to end up getting into some exotic cameras. So it's really not ready for prime time if you're just getting started with building things like the Donkey Car. So just be warned that that's the case, and just I would start with the Raspberry Pi. You can always buy the adapter and get ready for the future. Raspberry Pi is relatively cheap. You probably already have one, so you can always do both. These adapters, like I said, you can print it, and it's in the Thingiverse page for the Donkey Car. Alternately, you can actually buy it from the Donkey Car store. Okay, so let's get started on the Raspberry Pi. We assemble the Raspberry Pi with these little screws that are called thread forming screws. So they're pointed They're not, and they have like they look a little bit like wood screws, but they're not. They're designed specifically for plastic. And when you screw them in, my suggestion is that you go slow. So don't use always use a hand screwdriver, and because you can over tighten them, and be super careful about over tightening these screws. And the reason for that is that they actually cut their own threads as you screw them in. And if you over screw it in, it'll actually pull all those threads out, and basically just made it not work very well. Also, something worth noting is if you're careful with these screws, you can screw and unscrew these about 20 times. So don't unscrew the Raspberry Pi all the time. That's not a great idea. If you're not careful, you can only unscrew it and screw it about 4 or 5 times. So just be warned. Now I'll screw in the rest of these. Now at this point, you can do one of two things. You can install a Sombrero, and the Sombrero is really nice because you just plug it in and you're done. It has nice little XT60 connectors which pop through this little slot right here, and you can just wire up a battery. One thing to be warned about here, though, is that it requires some soldering, and the battery it uses is a LiPo battery, which is a much better battery, but it just doesn't come with most of the cars that we offer or that we suggest. So you have to buy a new battery, and then you have to solder one of these connectors onto the RC car. So just be warned that that's the case. But otherwise, it's a much better solution. Offers an on-off switch, eliminates this clunky battery that you have to find a place for. Provides a bunch of other nice features that make it much cleaner design. But just know that there's a trade-off, and that you have to do a little bit more soldering and a little bit more work. The standard design is to use these servo drivers, and this is an important thing. I try to keep these wires as short as possible. So to enable these wires to be as short as possible, you should put the little header on the same side as the 40-pin connector. So you do that and you screw it on as you would expect, in the same way as the Raspberry Pi. So you'll notice that I only screwed in 2 screws. That's actually sufficient. If you don't have enough screws, if you lose a screw, you can do that, or you can put all 4 in. It's on there very, very well, so it doesn't need anything more than that. So the next step I typically do is actually assemble the top chassis, and the reason for this is even though it's a little bit harder to reach in there and get things sorted, this actually protects the car. And the last step I do is these wires, because they're most likely to get unplugged accidentally and that kind of thing. So even though it's a little bit harder to reach in there, I typically do it that way. For the top chassis, I use a slightly larger screw. So the Raspberry Pi uses an M2.3 by 8 or M2.3 by 6, and M2.2 also works. Just know that M stands for metric screw, 2.2 or 2.3 stands for 2.2 millimeters or 2.3 millimeters. That's really what you need to use to screw in the Raspberry Pi. And just as you should know, an M2 screw, which is much more common, is actually a little bit too small. So just know that. These are M3 screws, and they're much more robust, which is why we use them for the chassis themselves. Because of the way we 3D print these, there's often a little bit of cruft in these holes, so you may need to kind of get this in there, kind of clear it out a little bit, and then screw it in. And this is 3 screws. Alright, and there we now have the chassis kind of set up and ready to go. You can see it's really coming together. And next steps, we'll do the camera. Alright, with the camera slides into the adapter, and you're wondering why don't we just have it screw in? Well, it turns out this camera, if you screw it in, it can actually short out some of the components. We really like this camera otherwise, but it just has that flaw. So instead of screwing it in, we just slide it in. And usually it slides in perfectly. I will say I've played with this to work on most printers. So if your printer is somewhere has a head diameter between 0.4 millimeters and 0.5 millimeters, which is most printers out there, it should just work and slide in. Maybe a little loose in some cases. If so, you can put a little dab of cyanoacrylate or super glue, and then you can just break it off and pull it out. But that's how it works. The camera, to install it, you have to twist the cable. That's kind of an important part of it. And then put it into this connector right here, the one in the middle. Now, to do that, you lift up either side, and then you stick it in. And you have to make sure it seats all the way in. So, there it goes. And you can see, once it's seated in there, you can just barely see the top of those leads. I've done this many times, so I'm used to it. But just know that you can, if it's hard for you to figure out where the things are, you can actually look inside the connector and see where the little pins are. You can look at the ribbon cable and know which side the conductors are on, and then be certain when you plug it in. It's also worth noting that some cameras have an opposite oriented cable. So if you get a standard Raspberry Pi cable, it'll actually just feed straight and not require this little twist in it. So just know that there's a few varieties out there. Sorry, it's kind of confusing and complicated, but that's just the world of these cameras. So that's the camera. The next step is to assemble it to the car. So the car, let me just review it really quickly. The car has several components that you should be aware of. One is, this is the RC unit. You're actually not going to use this. This is an RC receiver. So just know that that's there. You can actually pull it off if you don't want it. Save it for later if you want to turn it back into an RC car. But you'll be unplugging these two cables from it. So these two cables will be plugged in. You'll just take them out. There's another component here called the ESC. This is it stands for electronic speed controller, and it's basically what drives the motor, which is located over here. So you can knowing which one of these cables is connected to what is important, because this is the throttle. This wire, which is draped underneath in this case, but not always, connects to the servo. This is the steering servo that steers the vehicle. So knowing that that's the steering servo is also important. Now what you're going to do is you're going to take this, and when you assemble it, you're going to feed these through. But before I do that, I should probably just point a couple things out. One is that this car is either the Desert Monster or the Short Course Truck. They're both actually the same once you take the cars apart. And in another video, I show all the different cars and how the adapters work. This one already has the adapters attached. So I'm just starting with the assumption that the adapters are attached. So as you put this together, you just feed these two cables through. And then you can push down on the adapters. And it shouldn't take that much force, but in this case it is. And it will go down. By the way, if it takes a lot of force and you're uncomfortable with that, you can actually take just a little X-Acto knife and clean out the little hole from the other side. Sometimes that gets to be have a little bit of cruft in it. So now you have your two cables. You've probably forgotten now which ones connect to which, but you can just quickly look underneath and say, okay, this is the ESC. ESC goes into channel 0. Usually these are nicely coded. The black goes to the black, and you can just stick that on there. So throttle goes to 0. Servo goes to 1. And it turns out you have 14 more channels of PWM, which you can use for light arrays or anything else you want to use. Connect another servo. Typically people don't do anything with them, but they're there if you ever need to use them. But these two cables get connected. You connect them backwards. You'll find out during the calibration step, and you just swap them. There's no damage you can do. One thing about these little cables, these cables are red, white, and black. Sometimes cables are black, red, and yellow, or black, red, or brown, red, and yellow. That's just the way these things are. There's no kind of common standard. So typically, if it's black or brown, it goes to the black or brown connector on the bottom. That's the ground. You connect that way. If it's backwards, you just flip it around. It should not damage your car. So that's the servo connector. Next, there's just two more steps that we have to do in getting this set up and going. One is attach the battery. There's not a great place to put this battery, which is why we've gone to the Sombrero. But there's a few things we've done to make it a little bit better to attach this. So this is the battery we recommend. It's strong enough for kind of give you like several hours of usage on your Raspberry Pi. The thing with this camera, so it's a very nice battery. The thing is, it's super slippery. So you'll notice there's this rubber thing on it. Well, what is that rubber thing? This is actually a bicycle inner tube. I just cut a section out of an old bicycle inner tube I had and put it over there. It means that when you zip tie it on there, it stays in place much better. It's just a tip that I typically use, and you'll notice that I can also see the little lights through there. So that's typically how I zip tie it on, and that will hold it in place better than just zip tying it on by itself. So just a little pro tip that's not in the instructions. It's the value of watching this video, I guess, is you get to see that. So I then zip tie it on there. It's not very tight right now, but that's fine. I can tighten it. Actually, I'll just do it tightly so you see. We'll get a pair of pliers and you can tighten it down, and then you clip off the excess with the pair of clippers. So that's now the battery. The battery comes with one of these cables. You plug it in and you can power the Raspberry Pi. I'm not going to do that right now because I'll show the last step, which is connecting these 4 wires. We used to recommend really long wires, but now we use much shorter ones. And the reason for that is that the longer the wires are, the more likely they get caught and get pulled out. The one using these shorter ones, I've been using in my current car for quite a long time. Here's an example, and they've actually never pulled out. So really, really great. So let me go through the theory of these wires. People really struggle with these wires. They plug them into the wrong ones. So let me start with the theory, and that way, if you're confused, you at least know you can even step back to the guide in the Raspberry Pi. So if you look up online, you can actually find the pinout of this 40-pin connector on Raspberry Pi. We connect the I2C and power from the Raspberry Pi to this board. So that is 4 wires. Power, ground, so we want to make sure they have the same ground. And then there's 2 communication channels for I2C. One is called, I think, SCL, and the other one is called SDA. I actually don't know what those mean, but that's how they connect. So let's see here. How does this work? So I had 4 wires. They accidentally broke apart. That happens a lot. When that happens, just plug them in. So you start by plugging in these 4 wires, and I'll show you how I'm doing it. Sorry, it's hard to see. So you can see I have them plugged in, and the 3 last pins on the inside pins, because there's 2 rows, and then I skip one, and then I go to the last one, and then I go to this other cable. Perfect. So now the beauty of these things being color coded is I can see how they connect over here. So I'm using another car as an example while I do this, so bear with me while I do that. All right. So the first cable, which is black, is going to connect with the second cable, which is the VCC labeled pin. So VCC means power. That's 5 means actually 3.3 volts. So you connect the 3.3 volts to this. I'm sorry, it's actually VCC is actually 5 volts. My mistake. And the nice thing is that they actually connect in order. The same order as here, going out. So I have the white one next. So that one connects to the next one, which is the SDA. That's one of the I2C connectors. The gray one, which is the next one, plugs into the next one. Oops. Shoot, just bit that pin. And then this last one is ground. And the ground is actually the last one. So again, you skip one and you go to the last one. So that's how that connects. Hopefully that was instructive. Again, this is one of those things, unless you switch power and ground, you really can't mess it up. So don't switch power and ground. There's an example online. You can go look at the Raspberry Pi pinout. These pins are labeled. There's like 3 or 4 ways you can double check your work and make sure you get that right. With that, you're pretty much ready to go. You'll notice the battery is not plugged in this one, so you'll plug the battery into the ESC, which is right here. You have to make sure the ESC is on. That's a very important thing to do. And then you can plug in the Raspberry Pi, which I'm not going to do. One thing with the Raspberry Pi cable is you end up with these really long cables. I usually take a couple of zip ties and I zip tie it in various places to deal with this long cable because I don't like wires to be hanging all over the place. Now you're pretty much done with this car. You'll notice the value of the Sombrero now. The Sombrero eliminates all of these parts and just plugs in like that, and then you just plug in the throttle and the steering, which are nicely labeled. So you can tell why the whole thing is nice here. It eliminates this battery. You just use a switch and you can turn on and off the whole thing. So it's a very nice setup for the Sombrero. And with that, that's the car assembled. Next thing you'll do is you'll go to the documentation and go through how to get the disk image set up. Actually, one last thing that's worth noting, that here is the little SD card is in here. You notice there's a little slot so you can reach your finger in and get it out. Just know that it is a little tight. You may have to kind of fidget with it and then get it out. Some people complain about it, and there's actually even some alternate designs which some people like to make it slightly easier to get this in and out. I don't take it in and out that often. I usually just set up my disk and then leave it there forever, so I don't mind it so much. But some people like to take it in and take them out a lot, and you'll have to just get used to that. But again, you can just take it out right here and plug it in. And that's it. Hopefully this was informative. One other thing I forgot to show in this video, sorry, you do have to put these 4 pins back in. These are the little cotter pins that come with your RC car. If you buy the adapters from the Donkey Car store, I also give you 2 extras of these because certain cars only come with 2. So you just stick all 4 of these in like so, and this holds this together. The nice thing about these is you can easily remove them and then take them off without any screws. And there are 4. This is one of those cases where you should probably try and put all 4 in. Make sure you have them all in there. Thanks.